Okay, good afternoon and thank you all for coming. I'm Luigi Zingales, the faculty director of Hobbes, and we're very happy to host tonight Paul Tucker and Grotius Myerson for a conversation on Descendants of Hume, international relations with power, incentives, and value in global discord, featuring topics from Paul's newly released book entitled Global Discord, Values and Power in a Fractured Economy. Thank you, Paul and Roger, for joining us. Before we start, please note that we are on the record and we'll post this video on YouTube channel, so please silence your phones and remember that whatever you say will be remain there forever. We will take questions at the end. Please raise your hand and wait for the microphone so that people can hear your question. As usual, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Studio Center or the University of Chicago. Although they need no introduction, please allow me to give a very brief introduction to our distinguished guest. Paul Tucker is a researcher at Harvard Kennedy School. He spent over 3 decades in central banking, including as deputy governor at the Bank of England during the financial crisis. And he's also United, so we could call it SIR. And then Roger Myerson is a David Pearson Distinguished Service Professor of Global Conflict Studies at Paris and Professor of Economics here at the University of Chicago. He's, of course, also a Nobel Prize laureate in economics for his contribution on mechanism science. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcome our guest, Paul, our guest and Paul, to follow us.
Thank you very much, Luigi, and thank you very much, Roger. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. Is this someone sure that I can pass the?
Yeah,
I know what to do.
Yeah, I know what to do.
Brilliant.
Just to put this in the right position. Try. Is it working? Yeah.
So, I've written a book about international cooperation in a shifting global order. And it turned out when I was writing it that the guiding spirit of the book was the same as the guiding spirit of a book I wrote, came out 4 years ago, and Luigi also hosted events on called Unelected Power, which was about how on earth unelected agencies like antitrust bodies, central banks could possibly be legitimate in a constitutional democracy. And the guiding spirit of both was David Hume. And this is much more, I've now got the courage of my convictions. This is much, much more obvious in this book than in the previous book. And kind of what it does in a way, and I'll explain why I'm saying this in a moment, is it tries to bring back together 2 completely different scholarly worlds that somehow bifurcated in the course of the 19th century. The world of political philosophy, whose always representative in the book is a man called Bernard Williams, who was at Berkeley and Oxford. He has an Oxford kind of mind, and Cambridge. And then also less at front stage, but very much there throughout, are the ideas of incentive compatibility that have come from Roger and his peers in mechanism design. This is not going to be a little talk about international relations, but I want to give you a caricature of what it is to be an international relations scholar. Are any of you international relations scholars? So the caricature must then be very disciplined about the caricature. So the way international relations works is that you're doing a PhD, and at some point, God knows how and when this happens, you're allocated to one of 3 schools of thought. You either become a Hobbesian who thinks that all that matters is power and the world is anarchic, and you conclude pessimistically that we're always on the brink of disorder, or you are a Kantian where that problem is being overcome by the powers of reason, and you really want to talk about human rights rather than about war and peace, and at root you're an optimist. And then there's a middle way, typically associated with the Dutch international lawyer Hugo Grotius, but it may as well have been the German Samuel Pufendorf, who are kind of natural lawyers They want international society without any Kantian idealism, but it's still deductive. It's still, and the problem with this, I'm just trying to position Hume for a moment, is that imagine we're thinking about things in two dimensions. First of all, are people on the states basically sociable or not sociable? And secondly, to the extent that there is any authority, is it top down or is it bottom up? Is it organic? And Hobbesians will hold that the world is basically unsociable and all authority is top down. So we have a sovereign in a state. The world doesn't have a sovereign. Therefore, there is no international authority. The bottom up, and they're not Hobbesians, some positivists will get international regimes and international cooperation through agreements and consent. But they're always on the brink of defecting from these agreements. I mean, to caricature somebody who's not here to speak for himself, but can do so later today, Eric Potter might fit into bottom left box. The top right cell include both the natural law Grotians and the Kantians. The world is now sociable. We're not completely destined to be horrible to each other at the first provocation. But authority still descends from some kind of authoritative reason. There's nothing organic or bottom up about it. And the interesting thing about international relations is that with almost no exceptions, the bottom right-hand cell is empty. But I want to suggest that it's occupied by Hume, who argues in book 3 of the treatise, which if you read only one thing by Hume, it should be book 3 of the treatise. He was in his early to mid-20s when he wrote it. It's got informal game theory in it, and it's got arguments that he developed over the rest of his lifetime. He's saying, well, actually, we face problems and opportunities, and sometimes we do better if we manage to cooperate, and we kind of sometimes find ways of cooperating, partly through adopting a convention of some kind. Some of these conventions become habits, and they become part of our way of life. And this kind of spreads, not just within our group, but with the next village and the next town, and even in the state as a whole, and even sometimes actually we can even reflect on these norms as these conventions have now become. And we can say, actually, yes, we think these norms are okay. So it's just got kind of problem-solving conventions that become ingrained through habits and become social norms, become things that we value for their own sake. And one way of thinking about this is this is a kind of very crude way of thinking about it. If you ask a Hobbesian about a prisoner's dilemma type problem, I'll say, well, that's all terrible. We're going to end up in the bad cell. And then you say, well, what if you make a promise to cooperate? And the Hobbesian says, well, I just break the promise. Promise adds nothing. And the Humean says, oh no, the promise adds a lot. The promise adds a lot. That the promising isn't that Hobbes' covenant in Leviathan isn't. This is enormous. We can't just bring it out from nowhere. Promising is developed as a social practice itself. So if Luigi and I actually know each other quite well, we enter a promise. We might or might not cooperate with something. This has no material externalities at all. That what we do really affects us, but it really doesn't affect any of you. And we fail. We end up in the bad cell. And then we make a promise, and I break the promise. And it's a very public, formal, solemn promise, and I break the promise. Still no material externality, but now all of you have seen this in it. Tucker is the kind of guy that goes around breaking promises. The audience has been widened. We've got a situation where the only kind of, in a narrow sense, the only welfare thing going on is between Luigi and I, but there's something going on for you as well, which is I'm not the kind of person that you would kind of want to enter into solemn promises with, because I don't seem to care about solemn promises. Now, one way of thinking about this is that the game Luigi and I are playing is embedded in a higher level game, a game of promising. And that's a game with social sanctions that are not available to the kind of ground level game. So this is a rich thought. Let me say perhaps two more things. So we have our political communities, they go through time, they face problems and opportunities, they solve them or fail to solve them in various ways, they become attached to some of their conventions, which develop into institutions. And the reason they want to hold on to this isn't the simple international relations realists' doctrine that states want to survive. It's that the people in this state think it's worthwhile, it's surviving, because their way of life is kind of worth preserving in some way. So what's going on here is, as Hobbes put it, as Bernard Williams put it, what lies between facts and norms is legitimation. That these are vertical relationships. Someone has authority. Say, I have authority over all of you. I can coerce you in certain ways, but you can resist. If I don't exercise my coercive powers in a way that is tolerable to you, you will resist. You may just passively resist, but that will reduce the returns to me from the authority that I have. Because I quite like to hold on to my authority, I will move in your direction to the point where I've still got some positive returns from ruling, and you can now acquiesce in the authority that I have. But it's acquiescence. This isn't, you can go along with it. This isn't a Rousseauian social contract of some kind. And you can think about that in a different way, that what's holding this together is norms. It's not in some narrow sense interests, because it always makes sense for one of you to free ride, to be what Hume called the sensible knave. But you don't do so because if you resist to the point of undermining the system, you will face social sanctions from everybody else in the room. So the system is relying in some sense to be sustained on those social sanctions being there to conform more or less, most of the time, not all the time necessarily, with the norms. So this is a bridge between incentives compatibility and values compatibility. It's these things that keep us going in a political society are somehow values. Now, all this leads to the thought is, well, when you have a rising power, I don't think we should spend too much time on this, but when you have a rising power with a completely different tradition, different history of opportunities and problems, and that solved those problems or didn't in different ways, a different set of habits and conventions and norms and internalized values and institutions, we shouldn't be very surprised when contest between them is potentially put at its lowest, stressful, because two societies will each believe in, if you like, their way of life. This, by the way, in history, I think you can find in 18th century Britain and France. Let me say one more thing. I think it kind of means practically that it is easier to cooperate with those with whom we share more, meaning norms, and fear least. But what that creates is a world of concentric circles, and that's always perspectival. From our perspective, it will lead to in the inner circles, cooperation of our kind. But in the outer circle, it's always peaceful coexistence. And peaceful coexistence, whether it's created by a hegemon, the United States over the most of my biological life, balance of power in the 19th century, this is some kind of spontaneous order in the sense that it's a self-enforcing institution. And the institutions underneath it rely on the highest level institution being self-enforcing. The lower level institutions can be designed, but they have to be incentive compatible, which Roger and his peers have emphasized, and which Hume has. People think that Hume is like Hayekian. Hayek doesn't really want to let in design too much. There's a bit where Hume says, talks about the design of constitutions, and he says, but when you do this, but you've got to assume that everybody is a knave, even though they're not. Even though they're not a knave, you must assume that they are, because these things aren't going to be self-enforcing, except as held together by higher level norms and values. So the outer sphere is one of peaceful coexistence, if we can find it, and that will be to do with material power, finding ways of some protocols for de-escalating tensions like existed between the Soviets and Washington during the Cold War. As you move inside, then you get elements of design, but elements that must be designs that must be cynical in a sense, designs that must assume that people will be wanting to free ride when they can, but exposed to social sanction when they do. I think I will end there. The book, for what it's worth, has practical things to say about the international monetary system and the dollar and finance and trade and cross-border investment, and we could talk about some of those. But actually, I think if the book makes a contribution, which isn't for me to say, but if it does, it's in trying to insert into international political theory a kind of Humean flavor that marries Bernard Williams and Roger Myerson.
Thank you. Now, Roger, you have thought about self-enforcing institutions and emergence of corporations for a long time. So what is your view of the Humean perspective?
I really value this book a great deal. It's got me thinking in new ways and understanding some things more fundamentally. I think we were just discussing before the event when I don't recall whether Tom Schelling's writings refer explicitly to Hume, but and I'm not sure whether it might be Ken Binmore who particularly emphasized ideas in game theory as being having and in economic theory more broadly as having roots in David Hume, the game. What do you call it? Grandfather of modern economic theory. I think the idea that governing institutions must be both incentive compatible and values compatible, that is to say, they must be legitimate according to societies, the values compatible, meaning that they must that our institutions must be legitimate according to societies' particular history-dependent strategy for standards for legitimation. That's a central idea in this book. It's a perspective. It's a perspective that I embrace in my reading of Schelling. And Schelling may have, in many ways, exploring ideas that David Hume explored and other great social theorists. Great social theory can be reconstructed multiple times, but we understand that long-term social relationships can expand the potential for mutually beneficial cooperation between people. This is the folk theorem of repeated games, the structure of these reputational equilibria. But people have to be ready to understand what is the structure of our interaction. How do what kinds of things that you say make you understand that a particular promise you make is to be taken very seriously, and if you violate it, we should all treat you very differently, or switch to a different equilibrium. The problem is the folk theorem of repeated games and game theory is a good story. Is a good way. It helps to solve problems of prisoner's dilemma, problems of difficulty achieving mutual beneficial cooperation, but it also creates too many equilibria. And in some sense, the game theorist understands that there's a huge multiplicity of equilibrium, and this is what Schelling was in Strategy of Conflict. There's a coordination problem. He was looking at games. He was about to start talking about game theory when he wrote that. He was more influenced in game theory than influenced by it in 1957 when he began writing this book. But equilibrium selection is essential in a successful society. There's a fundamental coordination problem. That's the message I got from Schelling. Problem of coordinating among equilibria. Any one of those equilibria, by my understanding, my conceptual structure coming from John Nash's theory, says an equilibrium is something which all of us share. It's a way of all of us to behave, that all of us could behave such that if I believe all the rest of you are behaving according to this strategic pattern that we're calling this particular equilibrium, it's equilibrium. This means it's rational for me in pursuit of my own interest to do so as long as everyone else's. But multiplicity of equilibrium means it might not be rational for me to behave this way if everybody else thinks they're playing some other equilibrium. And we need to coordinate. Successful societies need ways of coordinating. So Schelling's focal point effect, his focal point effect was that anything that attracts people's attention, focuses their attention on one particular incentive-compatible Nash equilibrium. It's not compatibility, it's compatible with the constraints of Nash equilibrium. Creates a role for traditions, culture, leadership, even divination. That's important. I'll say more about divination. Identify that if there's some way that we understand that the divine spirit of there's nothing bigger in the universe than the universe itself, and if we think that the universe has a divine spirit behind it that expresses a preference or affinity for one equilibrium of our Nash equilibrium, little society here, or another, and it does by a particular mechanism that we all agree by killing a goat and looking at its entrails, for example, then that becomes extremely rational collectively rational for us to be guided by.
You can eat the goat.
Yeah, yes. I should mention Xenophon's case in his March to 10,000, the Descent of Cyrus. The Anabasis. That he describes himself killing goats to decide which way the Greek army should go. And he was the founder of, he wrote the first economics essay. So the idealist fallacy that Paul attacks in his book, and I think rightly, is one that we see also in game theory. If everyone accepted the equilibrium selection principles or the moral legitimation principles that I've axiomatized, then because they're creating an incentive-compatible system, it would be Nash rational for everyone to comply with them. And that's all very well and good, but it's not really where they come from. It's unfortunately, for better or for worse. Neither Kant nor Milton have remade any nations based on axiomatized principles. Hume rightly emphasized legitimation norms to be history dependent. And let me say, I think that's particularly important. Any national, the world is covered by nations, according to our atlas. Maybe there are other social structures that also, besides the nations that you see on your globe. But any identifiable social structure that exists, like a nation, a nationality that exists through history, must have some continuous principles for deciding who holds leadership. I want to emphasize it, and I was pleased. Thank you for quoting me on this point. I'm not the only one who said it. One of the things that makes leaders is their ability to select them the whole equilibrium. The whole mechanism design approach was based on characterizing the set of, in some cases, finding a simple characterization of the set of all possible equilibria in a game that had lots of equilibria, or possibly with adding a communication system. But that meant there's now within that feasible set that a leader can select anything, provided that he's recognized as leader. And Hume rightly remarks that, while in questions of physics, you might not want to be swayed by what everybody else thinks. In questions of moral philosophy, like who's the leader of our country, there's no other principle than what the hell does everybody else in the neighborhood think? But the question a central question that Paul Tucker is grappling with in this book that I think he's guided rightly by Bernard Williams is about it's a question of how moral must these legitimation principles be. I myself have had difficulty. I write papers where I want to use the word legitimate or legitimacy, and to me, it's often in my mind what I've been meaning when I write that is just whatever everybody thinks. If everybody thinks that I'm the leader, then that I am, and anybody would think otherwise. And if you don't think that, then I don't have any, or that I have authority to guide the group in some particular way, in some particular domain. That I have it, and if they don't think that, I don't. But the Hobbesian question is, well, can we legitimate a crude dictatorship, a crude tyranny that functions always for the benefit of the dictator or perhaps with a small circle around him? And you can say, well, maybe the dictator has been historically identified as the heir to some famous family, and that's what we do. Certainly. There's a divination concern, but if we have a concept of a moral spirit of the universe, then our leadership cannot be incompatible. The organization, the fundamental order of our society, of our nation, or any society we participate in, if it's seen as incompatible with the ultimate divine order of the universe, and if that involves certain principles of justice that everybody recognizes, then the authority will be undermined by its incompatibility with that, because we notice this. But plenty of times in history, people have argued that crude dictators, people who look to me like a crude dictator, were divinely ordained. So that doesn't necessarily get you so far. You have to have the right religion, don't you, I guess? We could argue about that. My APSR paper argued, and I think Hume, but now I learned from your book that Hume also said this, and I said I saw it in Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, that a leader who must fight for supremacy first and foremost needs a credible commitment, a reputational commitment for rewarding the service of the people who fight for him. So certainly justice for the captains in your army who lead your army is something you're at. But that doesn't get you very far. That doesn't mean justice for the peasants whose cows you're stealing to feed yourselves. The way I would assimilate what Paul gets from Bernard Williamson is something new that I hadn't seen before. I would call it a local resistance constraint. That people, it's just true, but people that individually we can do almost nothing compared to other animals, but together we do much more than any other critter that ever walked on this planet, and we do it by organizing. We have an instinct for organizing. We have an instinct for finding principles, rules that we share, and for selecting among ourselves people to exercise certain authority and coordinating us in solving these coordination problems in the multiple equilibria. So if the legitimation principle of an extensive national society included absolutely no consideration for the welfare of people in broad, identifiable communities that exist within this nation, then the people in these communities would see the national authority as being the so-called legitimate national authority as being the problem. This is what you get Bernard Williams calls not the solution but the problem. And now people within these communities might, as human beings, develop understandings among themselves to start recognizing within their communities alternative forms of local insurgent leadership to help them work together in moving from acquiescence to resistance against this national oppression that they're suffering, that they're enduring. So let me say that's the most important insight that I've taken from your book, and I've translated it into a different way to say that the focal coordination and natural identification of leadership and the search for principles of legitimation functions not just at a national level, but at a local level, and certainly did. We lived in communities before the communities integrated into nations. The question I want to ask is, how can the ideas in this book be applied to the problem of establishing a sustainable implementation of global policies for protection of the Earth's environment. When we think about that, the incentive compatibility is clear that taxes are needed or subsidies or something to dissuade people from doing things that generate too much greenhouse gases, for example. If we've come to the conviction that certain activities that profit us and locally as individuals generate a negative externality in an invisible gas that's dangerous, and we need to have a global coordination, and the nations are not large enough to do it. How do we do that? How do we make it both incentive compatible? We understand with taxes. Well, are the taxes legitimate? Or who's going to vote the taxes? And how do we tie that to a compulsion to have a sustainable institution that people is viewed as legitimate, that will create the appropriate incentives for solving global environmental problems. I'll stop there. How do we get there from here? And what are the principles in your book tell us about that?
So let me say that I'm very intimidated by dealing with this panel, both for the quality of the panelists and also for the intensity of the book. This is very heavy, not only physically, but there's a lot in it. So I will try, also the benefit of the audience, trying to unpack the way I see it, and I would like you guys to react. And at the end, I would try to push a little bit like Roger was doing at the end. What are the limits of the applicability? But let me start with the sequence. I see, first of all, there is a lot in this book, so it's hard to unpack it. But I see a number of important ideas, starting with this nesting or embeddedness of value chains. So the way I like to explain in very, very rudimentary terms, tell me if I miss the point, but it's, imagine we play an intramural soccer game on campus. Okay, there are the rules of the soccer game, but then there are the rules of the community on campus, which are bigger and somewhat interfere with the rules of the soccer game. And so the way I behave when I play soccer with my students or with my classmates really is impacted by the fact that people are watching. And I'm not just playing a soccer game, I'm playing a bigger thing. Am I sort of on the right track or not?
By the way, I would put this is so you play soccer, but my team is kind of pretty aggressive. Actually, when I was a boy, I kind of did run a little soccer team, and we played the other end of the village. And I think actually they were tougher than we were, so they could have broken the rules and beaten us up. But I think the rest of the village would have thought that was bad. In other words, why do they stick to the rules of soccer? They just have been, we're just going to beat you. But it's the people watching that enforce what counts as winning in the soccer game.
So I would actually, maybe I come from a different tradition, I would sort of relate this to Granovetter and the embeddedness of economics. So why, if I'm not mistaken, you don't cite Granovetter, you don't go in that direction. What am I missing?
Elaborate before.
I wonder when we talk about values, one of the things that is in this book is about how the creation of an institution will shape our own personal values. That as someone I'm a professor of economics, and as a professor of economics, I begin to actually think that it's just good to do economics research according to these high standards and carefully and to alienate my loved ones at home because I'm obsessed with getting the paper written correctly because it wouldn't do to not. And you could say I'm deriving that from getting a nice income that my family does better off if I can maintain my reputation and write good and I'm writing the papers well. But it doesn't feel like that to me. It feels like I genuinely care not only about certain, my children or my spouse, but I also care about economics papers and not only my papers, but your papers should be written the right way. That becomes a value. Is that what you're talking about? I was always speaking about values as shaping which equilibrium we're going to focus on. That you have the, we recognize, Luigi, that you are just the leader who should decide where this conversation should go for a variety of history-dependent reasons. And therefore, that would be, but I think might have been asking about whether institutions shape preferences, and the focal point effect is a way that a certain identifiable good or bad values, justice can affect even without affecting our preference. But we do get a preference.
I agree with you, but in part is in what game you are embedded. You are embedded in the game of being the best faculty. And so the only thing that cares for you is the quality of your papers. We see that some faculty members at some point in their lives decide to go for money. And all of a sudden, what matters is not what paper you have on JP, but how much money you made last year. Or others, they choose to actually be politically famous. And then it doesn't matter what they've said in economics the day before, is what their political buddies. So I interpret that all this is really contingent on the social relationship you are living in that moment, which of course helps to pick the equilibrium. But as long as you stay on the faculty, and there is a reason why we allow leaves only 6 years, because if the leaves are longer, then you don't play the repeated game here anymore, right? And then you are not one of us. You're something different.
But it will also be, so if you have, so this is, you were thinking about that in general for economics departments in top schools. You think, well, actually, the solution is going to have more or less the same shape at some high level of generality in all the different schools. But it will take the specific shape that it has in Chicago versus, I don't know, Harvard or the LSE will be different, because it will have the particular color of their particular historical path. So if you think about, take this to politics, you can say about the Western world, but including Confucian heritage states that are constitutional democracies, we all have constitutionalism and the rule of law, separation of powers, some kind of representative democracy. And we will say these are shared deep values, even though the way that they are instantiated in the United States and the UK and France, to just take 3 examples, fantastically different. And yet, so we've solved the same abstract problem, if you like, with the same broad shape, but with different specifics. But we recognize through the specifics, we recognize what is common. And what is common is I would say, one of the most important things is fracturing power, evidence being heard on both sides when a law is enforced against somebody. And we can see that those things are in common.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Across schools, they all try to solve the same problem, but history does matter.
Yes.
And even within the same school, in different groups, you can see the difference. So I think that Chicago, particularly finance, will be blessed by having leaders like Jim Feynman, who is always first at every seminar on time and dedicated, etc. And it's very difficult for anybody else to slack off when you have such an example. You do create some norms that get slowly acquired over time, but some people have a disproportionate role in playing those.
You have a norm in your economics department of senior attendance at seminars, that you wouldn't find everywhere else.
Absolutely. I find appalling that other schools don't ever see.
That just means that you perform it. But actually, that's the key thing. It doesn't matter what I'm saying. It's the thing that you experience that not just for its functional utility. You experience that as something worthwhile in its own right. That's where you've landed in terms of values around these things.
The internalization of values is helping to mitigate moral hazard problems. It's solving the incentive compatibility side of the question. I think it's, as an economist, I look at the success of our research communities. I think academic scholarship does much better than I'm able to understand by when I think about moral hazard in organizations. Like, and I think it does better than I would have expected, because there is an internalization. You get from hierarchy where people gain prestige by doing certain things, and people come to want to be the kind of person that will be recognized as a high prestige individual in a society, and that trick works. But we economists methodologically should be slow to recognize that, because we don't like. It's very hard for us to have endogenous norms. One among it is it could trivialize the moral hazard problem. The idea of Plato's Republic, the having a Leninist dictatorship of the people who have been educated to have the right justice values, and then just give them all the power and let them boss everyone at night courts to decide who to kill in the rest of the population on their own decision, because since they have the right values, it'll all be okay. We're suspicious of that, but it doesn't. It makes our institutions do better than others. I think the fact that that we live in a society where great universities like the University of Chicago have a broad social respect, that people think it's okay for them to get a lot of resources based on the fact that they're good institutions, they're legitimate, is very important to the success of this operation also. And that depends on legitimation in a broader sense, which is also fragile. It could stop, it could change. And that's something that in some sense the president of this and other universities meditates on at night before going to bed and deciding what to do tomorrow.
Yeah, especially in the face of shocks like COVID. Yeah. So take the norms. The norms are very well established. All of a sudden, there is COVID. People don't come to the office anymore. And then what happens when you restart?
Before answering that directly, this is also a peg to say something about legitimacy and legitimation. It's really, really. Legitimacy makes institutions more resilient. This thought works best thinking about government. So government travels through time, makes mistakes all over the place, sometimes kind of venal mistakes, sometimes mistakes of incompetence, sometimes mistakes of just bad luck, but people can't tell. And but on the whole, actually, this is particularly true in representative democracies. We vote out the people who feel let us down, notwithstanding the noise signal problem of working out what went wrong. But we don't question the system. That's really, really important. That representative democracy has the attribute that it lends resilience to the political system, because the system isn't coextensive with the people that are ruling us at any one moment. That's very different and actually it's different from the People's Republic of China, where the system is the leadership of the party. The only thing that would stand above that would be the norms of succession from one generation to the next. So the legitimacy basically allows things to go wrong without the whole show falling apart. I think it's tremendously important in that respect. Could I say something about one of the points that Roger makes? Roger was talking about resistance, and I was just delighted you picked up on this point, because I think the capacity to resist is passively or actively is tremendously important. So as you were saying it, I don't think I say this explicitly in the book, that is, resistance itself is like an assurance game, isn't it? It's like Rousseau's stag hunt. You can go, the example isn't very attractive, you can go hunting for a group of us, all of us on this side, we can go hunting for a stag. That's really quite hard work, but at the end we get a stag. Venison's very nice if you like venison. Or we can go our own ways, and we can hunt hare individually. That's much easier. We'll all go home with a hare. We'd be better off if we hunted the stag together. But we each have an incentive to break off and do the easy thing. If we all enough of us break off, then it's not possible. Resistance is like that, actually, political resistance. That if we stick together, we'll resist the oppressor. And we might well succeed. If we've calculated correctly, maybe it's 2/3 of the class now, we will succeed. If we stay out of trouble, well, maybe we won't, maybe we don't get individually oppressed ourselves, and maybe that's the easier life. And so what holds us together? Well, there's got to be some kind of common cause where dropping out of the resistance carries some kind of social sanction. This is, it's a rather abstract way of thinking about it. You think about those women and men in Iran now, or Persia. Now, this is extraordinary. People that are choosing to go out on the street, and the people that are people choosing not to go out on the street. Can you imagine? I've had to make a decision like that in my life. I've never been faced with having to resist the powers that be in my country or any of the states where I spend my time. It's basically, I regard their governance systems I live under as basically legitimate, even though I'd like lots of things to be improved. But the solution to that assurance game is kind of, the Staghound game is, example, by the way, is Rousseau. It's not mine, Staghound, it's the hunting thing. That's quite instructive as well, I think, about the value of glue that keeps people together.
Let me play a little bit the devil's advocate, because you sort of emphasize this human tradition that says history matters a lot. And I agree with that, it's important. However, history and traditions are also a very useful way for some powerful groups to extend their power beyond their prime. And to some extent, you represent a country that has done that to a point. Britain, it was would be an irrelevant second-order country and plays a major role in international politics as a result of this transformation, which a lot of people might feel is illegitimate and resent that. So how do you sort of respond to that?
Well, that's a brilliant remark, which is we would be Athens to Rome, even if we weren't still on the Security Council and so on. You live under a kind of slightly peculiar version of an Anglo constitution. The really important point here, I think, is whether political systems kind of leave gaps for people to resist, which isn't quite the word I want anymore, but within the law. So that they see injustice and press for more justice without threatening the system. So if you think about the women's rights movement over 150 years, 200 years probably since Wollstonecraft and so on, one of the earliest arguments is, well, you say we've got this kind of liberal republic where each man is worthwhile in their own right. Well, how about women too? I mean, in other words, those campaigners can hold on to, can say, well, actually, something you say that is animating this place isn't something that you're applying other than to one kind of person. So I think the extent to which political system it provides the resources to challenge the system without bringing the system down is tremendously important. I'm thinking about this because after here, I'm going to Arizona, which has got the Tucson, Arizona. It's got one of the best political philosophy departments in the world. And they're going to say, oh, there's a real problem of normativity here, Paul, which is okay, we develop these values, but why are they the values we should have? That's a really tough question. One of the practical answers is that political systems are better at this, if they provide these spaces for people to say, actually, things have got to change.
You want to comment?
I agree that principles of justice have often seemed beautiful until it was noted that some individuals were not being counted in the group that was promised equal justice. That can be remarkably stable in history.
But it comes together when you think about the rules of the thought experiment behind the veil, and people don't know their endowments. And I think he kind of assumes that they're a bit risk averse, and so they reach this accommodation. Of course, this was the first thought I had when I read it as a young man. I've got majors in language of America. I've got majors in maths, philosophy, not political philosophy. And I thought, well, hold on. When they discover their endowments, as soon as they leave, as soon as they appear from behind the curtain, they're not going to want to go along with this, or they may not want to go along with this. So the incentive compatibility is always there. And these kind of values incentives things are kind of pulling at each other.
The concept of a new coordination being solved within another community depended on that community not being infiltrated by those who were given privileges under the higher system. So obviously, both sexual disenfranchisement by gender could be stable for a period of time, regardless of how the injustice that we now perceive in it, because the men and women were together. The women were. If there had been a large part of the country populated only by women, they would have begun to organize more quickly as a group. The African Americans were, by skin color, denied legal and rights. Were prevented from communicating, and again, were mostly generally living in the context of oppressors who were privileged under the system and willing to do the work of enforcement. The right of movement and the right to learn to communicate with methods that would enable leadership to be organized on a broader scope would limit that, but much more limited was the ability to participate equally in the institutions of democracy, of politics in the country.
When we talk about international relationship, and particularly when you talk about treaty, etc., there is another institution that, in my view, plays a very big role, and I thought was maybe not so present in your book, which is corporations. They have some of the same power that sovereigns have. In fact, if you think about the power to set rules of coordinated games, corporations play a very big role. And today, Facebook has very more power than most governments in the world in many, many dimensions. Mm-hmm. So, number one, how do you see corporations in this game? And number two, this morning you were talking about, for example, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partner Alliance, and one of the things that I heard, maybe it's wrong, is that the very first version was completely biased in favor of some interests of American corporations. For example, hyper-protection of intellectual property rights. And the moment that the United States walked away, it was redesigned in a way that was less rational.
Not much. I think the US just scored an own goal by walking away from it. So your question, which is really a challenge, is very good. The simplest answer I have is I think that this is illusion of peace. I think that if we get into a really tense situation with the People's Republic, which I think that from time to time we will be in over the next century, I think that many multinational corporate leaders will go through reverse Stockholm syndrome and some will kind of psychologically, spontaneously combust as they find themselves having to choose. And that they feel at the moment they can wander around saying very positive things about everybody in the world because nothing turns on that. But I think if we get to the point where something really big does turn on that, they will discover that they have little power when the stakes are highest. This is what happened to German and British business in the run up to the First World War. I mean, it's hard to exaggerate just how embedded German banks and financiers were in the City of London into the run up to the First World War. I mean, German Gentile banks, German Jewish banks, German Gentile Jewish mixed banks, I mean, from all over the continent. And that didn't help preserve the peace, and the businessmen, and mainly men then, of course, found themselves utterly marginalized in this wave of destruction. I think it's incredibly instructive as an example, because in a sense the stakes were so low in the First World War. In ex ante, exposed, they were incredibly high. It's not like the Second World War, so I think we can learn a lot from the First World War. So I think at the moment, people that go to Davos think they're at the center of the universe. But actually, financial crises are like this. Everybody's terribly confident and powerful until they run out of money, and then they go around. I mean, I want to choose my words carefully because we're live. Many of the leaders of financial institutions that failed during the financial crisis found it difficult to cope. But that's said without any criticism whatsoever. It is very difficult to cope when everything you think you understood and knew about is falling apart underneath you. And government is more ruthless than business. I'm sure. I used to try and tell people this in my old life. Think about Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. Goldman Sachs wants to beat Morgan Stanley every time, but it actually wants Morgan Stanley to thrive because it wants there to be a market. Politics is not like that, believe me. Central banking, thank God, it's not politics, but it gives you a kind of view of politics. International politics, stakes highest, is brutal. I think our generation has yes. And that's why, I mean, there's a wonderful paper by a man called James Ferret, who's a political scientist, international relations scholar at Stanford. And the model is about, well, you know, God, wars are incredibly costly. Can't we bargain our way out of here in advance? So you reach the bargain, it's worth nothing. Because if you can only win the war, I mean, if winning the war means you can actually reconstruct the whole international order, your incentives to stick to the bargain are incredibly weak once you reach the point at which you think you can win the war. So bargaining is tougher when the stakes are so high. No, even Mr. Facebook doesn't operate at that level of global dominance.
It is the history of the August 1914 to me is an episode worthy of much contemplation, where Europe had almost a century of mostly peace because of creation of international norms and institutions that enabled people to understand that if they deviated in one way, if they were too aggressive, that there'd be a negative feedback, an adverse feedback from other countries, and according to some principles of justice that were broadly accepted on the continent, but to know who was wrong and therefore deserved to be attacked. Well, when the German army invaded Belgium, remarkably, almost everybody in Germany thought this was a justifiable response to an intolerable provocation by the Russians, the French, and almost everybody in Britain, Russia, and France agreed that it was an intolerable injustice. So what does the subgame that they have all been playing together for 100 years say at this new surprise event was something that people differed on, and they didn't differ based on, I suspect, the people who were Englishmen working in London for affiliates of German corporations bought the English view of it, that it was an unjust invasion. The national identity created the recognized national leaders, who were just one kind of, their corporate leaders or international leaders. I don't know whether anybody asked the Pope in the Vatican what he thought in August 1914. And I don't know whether he tried to hold forth on the question. But major religious leaders, as far as I know, didn't sway anybody. But national leaders had a profound ability, and the socialists, who everyone thought were part of an international movement that all recognized the unity of interests of the workers against capitalist oppression. The German socialists lined up on the German side of the question of what was justice in this case, and the French socialists lined up on the French side. So as a pragmatic point, the nations of Europe, which is one particular part of the world, were the units that determined what the legitimating principles were, but I think that in the story that I'm seeing, it's one where, according to certain principles, people have been legitimated as the leader of their country, who was the Kaiser in Germany, who was the president of France, who were history dependent. But then when those guys said, this is how we should interpret this situation, what's right and wrong here, and they were the most persuasive by far. And for the reason that people felt that it's important to be, it's really difficult to have a radically different view of basic issues like this from everybody else in my nation. I don't want to deviate from my nation, not my corporation, not my religious faction, but my nephew. So what's true in 2022, I don't know, but in 1914, it's very clear the nations in Europe, were the units that determined.
There was Anil who had a question.
It must also come up.
Change the topic, but you want to pass, you can't fall. Anyway, I'll yell like Luigi. So for not having read the book, I'm just curious what the rejoinder is to the line that Roger started on. That this sounds a lot like the folk theorem of repeated games. So it sounds like, at first, a lot of what you're saying sounds like you reinvented reputation as a thing that can coordinate and improve outcomes. And so what's the prediction, your view on how this stuff is sustained that most of us would find most surprising of an insight? I mean, if you accept that we know repeated interactions allow us to sustain many things, and we know that picking amongst equilibria are tricky, and I don't think there's a general principle that we can invoke for how we rule out multiplicity. But you must have an implicit prediction or two about where you think your way of looking at the world gets us. I don't know if that makes any sense. If it's silly.
It does. So first of all, I'm open about the focal point jelly thing. I think it's more than just repeat games. And I think what I add to that, compared to most social sciences that employ that, is something about the normativity of those values, which we won't get into now. I don't know whether you think this is novel or not, but to the extent to which the history-dependent norms that hold Chinese society together and our society together are from histories that are so different, with our having a long history of fractured power well before post-Reformation separation of powers. We've got Pope and canon law, the emperor, and Roman law. We've got a tradition. We, by the way, I've noticed, including North America and Western Europe, it's the traditions of Western Europe that count this argument. These are completely different from the traditions of unitary hierarchy. And this is going to be very difficult to overcome. So I don't know whether this is new for you, but for those people that say, this is just a standard rising power against another established power. This is Athens and Sparta. This is the Second Reich and Britain at the end of the 19th century. I say, oh, no. This goes much deeper. It's certainly closer to Sparta and Athens than to the Second Reich and Britain. This is ways of life, much more like Britain and France in the long 18th century, which is about types of power. Burke said at one point, the problem isn't the power of France, it's the wrong kind of power. And at the beginning of the 18th century, it was absolutist universalist monarchy. At the end, it was absolutist revolutionary universalism. And, you know, there were lots of people in favor of that. And my country wasn't in favor of that because we hadn't got either an absolutist or a universalist tradition. And that struggle went on for 140 years. So, and you will, I mean, being slightly assertive, all the parallels that are made in the discussions about China and the West, that parallel is rarely made, but actually it's achieving some resonance with IR people. A lot of IR people say ideology doesn't matter. And I'm saying it's even deeper than surface ideology. These are ways we have learned to live and to solve our own local cooperative problems. We have learned to solve our own local cooperative problems through fractured power. They've done it through unified power. That's quite a difference.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time.
If you want to say one last word about how you're going to solve
I will say two things. One of which is pessimistic and the principle of game theory, and the other is optimistic and very much draws on Hume. So William Northouse and others say, well, actually, we could embed the climate game in a trade game. If people renege on certain trade pacts, there could be a right to introduce tariffs and so on. And I think if we'd done that 25 years ago, that would have been really smart, really, really smart. But the trade game is embedded in a security game. So if I was Xi and we three went to him and said, actually, you should do this and the other, and he said, how much is it going to cost? We'd have to give him the answer in numbers of aircraft carriers as well as renminbi. Unit of account is an aircraft carrier. So I think that makes it much, much harder at that level. I think there's something kind of slightly more optimistic that can be said. I think Hume was really brilliant at finding solutions for things. And his strategy was to broaden the issue. And actually, in the West, climate campaigners on the whole have narrowed the issue in two ways. First of all, they've made being really, really caring about the climate crisis, they've made it sound and feel left-wing. That's a mistake if you need to carry some right-wing people. I don't mean crazy right-wing people. To carry some center-right people because they win elections occasionally in doing something about climate change. In my own country, the first mid-20th century environmentalists tended to be small c conservatives, not from the rationalist left. The other thing is, and I understand why, climate campaigners have wanted to do two things at once. They wanted to argue what should be done, and secondly, whose fault it is. And now I'm drawing on my own experience. I was 20 years a staffer before a dozen plus years as a policy maker internationally, as Luigi kindly said, as well as domestically. And actually, on the whole, if you want to get agreement to something, you mustn't compromise on the substance of the agreement, but you don't need to trash other people's lives to get there, particularly if you need their votes along the way. But I think the Humean spirit is to focus on the goal and broaden the issue. This is something that affects everybody. It isn't a measure of which tribe you belong to. It's a measure of which planet you are on.
With this wonderful, thank you very much to both of you.